I'm here today to speak to you about the situation of the Jewish community in Ukraine. Now, just a short while ago, in 2013, if you had asked members of the Jewish community in Ukraine what one of their main worries was, they would respond that one of the top worries, just like Jews in Hungary or Greece, was the rise of the far right, the anti-Semitic Svoboda Party, which had previously gotten about 10% of the nation's parliament. And when you have a country where 10% of the parliament is controlled by a party which is considered to be neo-Nazi by the World Jewish Congress, you know you're in trouble. You know something's wrong. And the Jewish community was worried and trying to figure out what to do about this. There were discussions. You had international Jewish groups talking. And during the midst of this dialogue, during the midst of this fear, during the midst of the worry, the Maidan revolution breaks out. The Ukrainian people said, we've had enough of the corruption, we've had enough of the problems facing our country, we've had enough of this pro-Moscow tilt. And when President Viktor Yanukovych decided to cancel a planned agreement with the EU, which would have boosted trade and various political ties, the people took to the streets. And as the violence, as the fighting, as the revolution in the streets of Kiev's Maidan Square got worse, you started to see an increasing presence of figures affiliated with the Svoboda Party. You see Svoboda flags everywhere. You see Svoboda activists in helmets and balaclavas, wearing heavy boots, carrying bats. The Svoboda Party took over the municipality building, hung their flags everywhere, and it was getting very scary, because not only are they in parliament, now they're in the streets, and they are involved in violence. And then the anti-Semitic incidents started. I was in Kiev during one phase of the Maidan, and I ran into swastikas in the street, and the sight of all of these Svoboda people really threw me back to how I imagined it must have been like in the late 30s in Germany. It's all of these flags of Nazi parties, armed thugs in the streets. And you started to see some limited violence against Jews. One yeshiva student was stabbed and was found bleeding in the local mikveh. He had made his way to compound with the synagogue and hid. Another Jewish figure, dressed very outwardly Jewish in a way that's readily identifiable, was beaten in the street and experienced anti-Semitic slurs, and people were getting worried. Jewish community leaders were saying, don't get involved, don't go to the protests, and of course young Jews were. You had people both fighting in the streets, bringing supplies, involved in peaceful protests, violent protests. The Jewish community was involved, even if not at any official level, but a lot of the young people were. And so things really felt like they were going in a bad direction. And then Yanukovych fled. And you see members of Svoboda getting into the new cabinet. And the Russians start saying, well, the new government is fascist, the new government is anti-Semitic. And while on a whole it wasn't, there's still that nagging feeling in the back of your head, well, haven't they brought in neo-Nazis? And then everything changed, because while the Russians are screaming at anti-Semites, Ukraine holds free elections, and because of, at least in my opinion, because the agenda of Svoboda had been taken up, the anti-Russian agenda had been taken up, and by all of these more centrist parties, more moderate parties, they were undercut. They have no more support. And suddenly, you go from 10% of parliament is anti-Semitic to, well, barely any of them are, or at least if they're anti-Semitic, they're not mentioning it and they're not part of a party that is, expressly against Jews. So you would think things would get better for the Jewish community. And from the perspective of anti-Semitism, from the sense of anti-Semitism, yeah, things have gotten better. In fact, in order to counter claims of anti-Semitism coming out of Moscow, you've seen groups like the far-right militant group Pravi Sector actually come out and protest in favor of Israel during Israel's summer war with Gaza out in Dnipropetrovsk. They were marching with Jews, holding Israeli flags. You've had Pravi Sector people coming out and painting over swastikas, painted in streets. And you've had this big effort to distance Ukrainians from anti-Semitism, to say, no, that's just the Russian propaganda. Because anyone paying attention can recall that Putin, when he came in and annexed Crimea, said, well, I have to protect the Russian speakers, I have to protect the other minorities, and I have to protect the Jews. Suddenly the Jews find themselves as a ping pong ball in the propaganda. Nobody is saying we don't like the Jews or we're against the Jews. Everyone's saying we're here to defend the Jews. And that's a very awkward position because this is an acrimonious war. People are angry, people are dying, people are fighting. Suddenly you have an insurgency in eastern Ukraine, and it's all about the Jews. Well, it's not, but people are bringing the Jews in. And you know, when you have two warring sides and suddenly the Jews are in the middle, that can't really end well. But things seem to be getting better on the anti-Semitism front. In fact, I spoke with one Jewish refugee from Donetsk who I've become friendly with over the past year, and he recalled being on a bus, and a young skinhead gets on and comes up to him and says, you filthy Jew, this is all your fault, I hate you, get out of here, Žid. And the entire rest of the bus got up as a mob and physically hauled the anti-Semite off the bus and apologized to him. But this isn't to say that things are perfect. In fact, things are very bad. And the reason things are very bad is, one, because of the war, and two, because of what could happen otherwise, afterwards. One of the primary shakers behind the war right now is the governor of the Dnipropetrovsk region, Igor Kolomoisky, a Jewish oligarch, one of the wealthiest men in the country, and someone who's personally funding both the Jewish community in his part of the country and militia battalions fighting against the separatists. You have very prominent Jews involved speaking against the separatists. You have Joseph Zissels, the head of the VAD, Committee of Ukraine, taking a very nationalist Ukrainian line. You have the chief rabbi, Yaakov Dov Bleich, with a very anti-Russian line. You really see the Jewish community coming out and taking a very pro-Ukrainian line, whereas before they wanted to have nothing to do with it. Now, in such a militant environment, such a wartime environment, they feel either they're very loyal to their country or they feel that they have to be. But whatever the reason, they're very prominently pro-Ukrainian. And when you have prominent figures involved in the running of the war, such as Kolomoisky, if things go bad, you could have a backlash. Now, at the moment, you do have neo-Nazis fighting on both sides in eastern Ukraine in the Donbass region. You have the Azov Battalion of the Ukrainians, which is made up of members of neo-Nazi groups. You also have neo-Nazis fighting on the Russian side. But Jews do not seem to be the major problem. During the early stages of the war, masked armed men started handing out flyers in Donetsk, the center of the insurgency. It's a city that was a city of about 1 million people before the war. It's about half that now. And these flyers stated, Jews, come and register. You need to register. We have to know where all the Jews are and what property you have. Well, the local rabbi sent a representative to the separatists, and they told him, get the hell out of here. What do we care about the Jews? It's not our problem. So on the one hand, both sides have been good to the Jews as Jews, even though recently we did see what seems to me to be something that could have negative repercussions down the line, bringing the Jews back into the conflict. We've seen that the head of the Donetsk People's Republic gave a press conference calling the Ukrainian leadership Jews in a derogatory sense, as if to discredit them for being Jewish, which is something that the Russian media does quite a bit of, alleging Jewish ties of leading people in Ukraine. Now, the fact that the Donetsk People's Republic is doing this is quite strange, given the fact that the foreign minister of the DPR is a former camp counselor from a Jewish agency summer camp. So it's very contradictory. It's very hard to really say what the attitudes are on the ground. But the real hardship for the Jewish community in Ukraine has not been from anti-Semitism. what everyone thought would be the threat hasn't been the threat. The threat has actually come from the people who are ostensibly protecting the Jews. When Putin comes in and says, I'm doing what I'm doing to protect the Jewish community, that's the problem. Because what we've seen is Jewish communities that were decimated by the Holocaust, repressed under communism, and had their numbers wiped out by emigration following the fall of the Soviet Union, when the majority of new immigrants to Israel from the Soviet Union were actually Ukrainians. Well, these communities, over the past couple of decades, have managed to rebuild themselves and reestablish themselves. Against all odds, they managed to create viable communities. And now these communities in places like Donetsk, Lugansk, Sloviansk suddenly find themselves completely untenable because the war has completely destroyed the fabric of their lives. Out of between 10 and 11,000 Jews in Donetsk before the war, 75% left. You have about 2,500 or so who remain. It's hard to get exact figures given how in flux things are, but the latest estimate from community activists over that way is about 2,500 left. Many of them are elderly pensioners. You also have people who are too poor to get out, and now obviously it's very hard to leave. But the people who are left are on food aid. You have crowds of hundreds showing up to the synagogue and the Jewish Community Center every day trying to get food. You've had a number of Jews in Mariupol and Donetsk and other cities who have been struck by rockets. A rocket recently hit right near the synagogue, about 300 meters away, hit a bus, burning people. And you see this situation where it's just hard to maintain the fabric of Jewish life. Many of the people who left, you've had several thousand who came to Israel, but you've also had thousands who have become internally displaced persons, IDPs. They are going from city to city in Ukraine, going through different transit camps, being helped by local communities. The Rabbi of Donetsk, Rabbi Vyshensky, brought a group of about 200 people out with him to Mariupol, where they subsequently felt that they had to flee again because they were scared of bombardments on the city, and they went to Kiev. You have Jews scattered throughout the country in Shpola, Cherkasy, Zhytomyr, Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk. Some have gone to, I think some have gone to Crimea, people have gone to Rostov in Russia, but it's very hard to keep track of where these people are. The Jewish communities have been doing what they can to drive around, send people going around, bringing people food, supplies, but people have lost their savings. People are finding it hard to rent an apartment, almost impossible to find work. So these people are in flux. They've become the wandering Jews of Ukraine with very little help. And you have groups like the JDC, which is doing a lot, the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews, Chabad. But this is one of these issues that because it's not coming from anti-Semitism, because their troubles don't stem from hatred of Jews, it hasn't had that traction among the larger Jewish communities of the world. And when the problem started, when the Jewish federations in America, for instance, tried to raise money, one Federation fundraiser told me that because it happened right after the troubles in Israel, they had donor fatigue. It was very hard to raise money. And this has been a real big problem because aside from the war itself, the financial situation of Ukrainian Jewry is absolutely horrific. The middle-class donor base, the people who were really giving indigenously within the community, has dried up. Now, you had three sources of money for Ukrainian Jews. You had local funders, you had oligarchs, and you had outside Jewish organizations from outside the country. Well, the outside Jewish organizations are still giving, and they're trying to up their game because the number of people they're servicing has risen just by a great deal. And the oligarchs, well, a lot of them are putting money into militias or are suffering from the economic collapse of Ukraine themselves and no longer have the same amount of money. And so you're finding these Jewish communities that are really on the edge, that are maintaining services, upping the level of services they give because the number of people who require them are higher, but you're going to run into a very big problem for the Jewish communities. Now, when it comes back to anti-Semitism, the worry, I think, at this point is if things continue to go bad and Jews continue to remain the center of propaganda, this could have a boomerang effect. Right now, it's almost de rigueur to be philo-Semitic to a certain degree, because you don't want to look like you're following doing what the Russians accuse you of. How long that's going to last is hard to tell. The propaganda coming from the Russian side has been intense. Several months ago, I was sitting for Shabbat lunch with some friends, and they had another guest who was an immigrant from Russia, and he told me, well, did you hear what just happened in Odessa? And I go, well, what happened in Odessa? He goes, well, Izvestia reported that there was a pogrom. So after Shabbat, I go online and I find both Izvestia and Pravda reported that Pravi sector had committed a pogrom in Odessa. Well, something sounded very weird there. So I call up a friend of mine in Odessa who I know through a series of phone conversations. He's been very helpful to me in getting information on the Jewish community there, because I spend most of my time in eastern Ukraine. I haven't had the chance to visit Odessa yet. I basically go to the areas where the most trouble is, and I ask him, what's happened in Odessa? And he goes, what do you mean what happened in Odessa? Well, wasn't there a pogrom? Hold on, let me check. Two seconds. You hear him yelling in Russian. 2 seconds later, comes back to me, pogrom? The hell are you talking about? Nobody's gotten hurt. Well, the Russians made it all up. And this is what's happening. Now, when I go there, when I speak to people, the stories coming out of the Jewish community are horrific. I was speaking with one person who had fled Donetsk, and asked him, well, what made you decide to leave? He said he was walking down the street. Suddenly he hears what sounds like an incoming bombardment. He flies onto the sidewalk. Boom, boom, boom. He gets up. Woman's lying there on the street, puddle of blood. She gets up, dusts herself off with one arm, walks off. She's missing an arm. So this is the type of stories that these people are experiencing on a daily basis. Whereas you or I, anyone in this room, would be only used to such violence from the news, where it's sanitized, or from seeing movies where you're at an emotional remove. This has become daily life for Jews in eastern Ukraine. And as I said, because they're being targeted as Ukrainians in the wrong place at the wrong time and not as Jews, it's very hard to get people to care, especially in Israel. I think there's a certain, while in America it just hasn't had the same resonance because Americans can connect to British Jewry or Greek Jewry or French Jewry because they're from Western or Southern Europe. It's more of a similar culture. There's more of a connection. You could see yourself in their place. It's very hard for many American Jews to connect with Eastern Europe on an emotional level. Okay, they know maybe our family came from there a century ago, but there's not that resonance. And that's been the major problem. And now in Israel, you have plenty of Russian and Ukrainian Jews, and they care. But among the average non-Russian speaking Israeli, you have another problem. And that problem is there's that ideology, Zionist ideology, of the negation of the diaspora, what we call the Shlilat HaGolah in Hebrew. And that concept amounts to, well, the only legitimate Jewish life is in Israel, and you're somehow less of a Jew if you're not there. And when I speak to people in Israel and I go, well, this is a problem, what's happening there, we have to care, they go, well, they should have come on Aliyah, they should have moved here, they should have immigrated with the rest of the Soviet Jews. And it's almost impossible to convince them that we should care. They go, oh, well, I care a bit, but it's not enough to motivate me to do anything. And that's really the problem. It almost feels like a reverse anti-Semitism. They're so philo-Semitic, so pro-Jewish nationalism that someone who doesn't agree with that, or maybe doesn't have the capacity physically or economically to engage in that and to come, or even someone who just wants to build their own community in the land where they grew up, there's not going to be that same amount of sympathy for them. Now I'd like to actually end, before I take questions, with a slightly more amusing story from Ukraine, because I hate to be depressing, and that is during a recent trip to Mariupol, I was passing a checkpoint, and I wanted to take a photo of the checkpoint. I'm there with a photographer and a driver. And we go up to the soldiers, can we take a photo? They go, no, but if you go 30 meters off this little dirt path off the highway, there's a bunker, our commander's there, ask our officer, maybe he'll give you permission. So we go and I ask the commander, well, through a translator, can you take a picture? He goes, no, but you can take a picture with me. And he looks in the back of the car and he sees that I have a flak jacket. He goes, put on your body armor. So I go, okay. I put on my body armor. I figure, well, you can get the checkpoint in the background maybe. I can crop the photo. I need something for the paper for the next day. And so he grabs me after I get my body armor on, hugs me in close, and yells something in Russian. Next thing I know, a Ukrainian soldier starts running at me holding a Kalashnikov. And he picks up his gun and he throws the loaded Kalashnikov at my head. And I catch it. And I did 2 years in the Israeli army. My first instinct, if I'm holding an assault rifle, is to put the strap around my neck and hold it properly. So I put it on, almost unthinking, and I'm standing there, and I look down. Holy God, I'm holding a Kalashnikov in eastern Ukraine. And I look at the commander, and I say in English, and I know he can't understand me, and I go, I'm a non-combatant. And I look at everyone around me, and I go, holy God, I'm a non-combatant, what am I doing? And he screams in Russian, and next thing I know, my driver picks up my DSLR and starts taking photos. And I'm just standing there bemused. If this gets out on social media, my God, I'm in trouble. I'm a non-combatant. And you know, there's always bright spots, funny spots, but what's happening there is not funny. And I think we need a little bit more public knowledge about what's going on. And now I'd like to open it up if anyone has a question or would like to ask something.
I have a couple of questions, but thank you very much, Sam.
Thank you. Can you look like an observant Jew in Ukraine? That's a good question. You can. I asked one person there if they felt if it was dangerous to wear a kippah. And his answer was, no, but I would worry if I was in Paris. And I can agree with that. I don't know if anyone here saw the recent viral video online of Israeli journalist Zvika Klein walking through Paris for something like 10 hours, wearing tzitzit and a kippah, with a guy with a hidden camera, and how people would yell at him and scream at him. One little Arab boy asked his mother, well, doesn't the Jew know that he would die if he comes in our neighborhood? What's he doing in here? So, no, I would not worry to look Jewish in Ukraine. There, since the few attacks we had around the time of the Maidan revolution, there have not been attacks on Jews necessarily. Babi Yar was defaced a couple times, but individual Jews being killed as Jews, no. I would be more worried to be in the eastern parts because then you could get hit by a rocket, and that's happened to a number of Jews. That's a real problem. If you're worried about being attacked as a Jew, I'd be more concerned in London or Paris or certainly Athens. My predecessor as Jewish world correspondent for the Jerusalem Post was actually beaten to a pulp in the streets of Athens by extremists. So that's the good thing. Ukraine, you might get hit by a shell, but at least you can wear a kippah. So you asked if the Ukrainian Jews had the same experience as the Soviet Jews in terms of suffering, and the truth of the matter is, it was the same. The Soviets were just as bad in Ukraine as in Russia. In fact, if we go back to the 30s, the Soviet government actually created a man-made famine in Ukraine which killed millions, called the Holodomor. And so I would say it would actually have been worse to be a Ukrainian than a Russian. But when the Soviet Union fell, the majority of the Jews at that time were, as far as I know, in Ukraine, because the majority of the Jewish immigrants to Israel were Ukrainian. However, when I actually asked Natan Sharansky, the chairman of the Jewish Agency and a former Soviet refusenik, himself from Donetsk, why people in Ukraine are not making Aliyah, not moving to Israel in higher numbers, at least in the beginning of the war, before the numbers shot up. And what he said, I think, was very instructive. He said this is the hardcore of people who either would not or could not make Aliyah when everyone else around them was emigrating, either to New York or to Israel. And these are the people who were very, very much built their lives there. And what you saw is, during the beginning of the war in Ukraine, a lot of the refugees thought, oh, well, we'll be able to get back to our houses. We don't want to leave for Israel. We will stay here even if we're homeless. Why? Because they managed to scrape out an existence and build a thriving community even after everyone left. And that's something people remain committed to. Also keep in mind that demographically, the Ukrainian Jewish population is weighted heavily towards the older, towards more elderly people. You have a lot of pensioners, a lot of people who've lived their whole lives and who might not be able to physically or economically manage the move. So you have almost like a captive population. So it's very difficult to say, well, why can't they just leave? As many as can leave are being helped. In fact, the Israeli government recently gave 2 million shekels to the JDC to help for internal resettlement and refugee rehabilitation, but it's unfortunately not so simple. Yes. I think the Ukrainian Jewish community on an official level is very, very supportive of the government. You know, before the war you had various opinions. The Jews in eastern Ukraine obviously were less supportive of the government and of Maidan than the Jews in western Ukraine. The same split, east-west, that applied with everyone else applied to them as well. I think that after everything that happened from the war, Jews from eastern Ukraine obviously aren't pro-separatist, at least the ones who have gotten out. Obviously the ones who are still in eastern Ukraine under separatist control are going to be less likely to speak out against them. There's definitely Jewish communities that are pro-Russian takeover in Crimea, and certainly the Russian Jewish community on an official level has been very, very pro Russia's role in Ukraine. When the Crimea was annexed by Putin, when they held a ceremony marking that, the chief rabbi of Russia, Beryl Lazar, was seen on video standing up and clapping. Yes, we've taken Crimea back. So, you know, in each country, the official communal organizations and leaders are obviously taking a stand with the country they're in. It's not really like as if there's much of an option, but I think the same way that much of the West is on the Ukrainian side because of the blatant nature of Russia's aggression. I think that the Jews in Ukraine feel that they've been the victims of aggression, and everything that's happened has been because of this. And some are obviously going to blame, the Maidan protesters, and some of them that I've spoken to have blamed the Maidan protesters. And it's again, hard to quantify. I think there's general trends, but on the individual level, there's a wide range of opinion. Thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.